everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast, I have someone who is actually like a in real life friend. Oh yeah, Josh Morris is on the podcast. He did his PhD in practical theology. He is a chaplain, a military chaplain who served in Afghanistan, and like me, he is a geriatric millennial, which means that our coming of age in the church happened before 9/11, and our finding our voice as a leader in the church happened after. And so I'm really excited to talk now. Before we jump in, why don't you just say your book, like a bit about your book, so everyone knows and hears about it. But I want to focus on your story that leads up to being a chaplain who also does a PhD in practical theology at Claremont and such. But what's the invitation to the book?
Hey, Trip. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. The book is called Moral Injury Among Returning Veterans: From Thank You for Your Service to a Liberative Solidarity. Mm-hmm. So what the book is it comes out of my time, not only in Afghanistan, but coming home and providing care and counseling to veterans and their families, and just getting frustrated with the way the church, society, culture talks about veterans in the midst of just the broader narratives of military service, war. What does it mean to thank someone for their service? What does it mean to say we don't kneel for the anthem? All that stuff that I know we'll get into, that stuff really frustrated me. And so I needed a space to write about it in a really developed way, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and it's a spectacular book. So if I don't ruin this interview, all of you will definitely want to go check it out. What maybe the place to begin is on 9/11 itself. We're getting near the 20th anniversary as we're recording this. Like, where were you, and how did that day kind of shake the vision of the world, faith, country, and such that you had?
Yeah, and so I've been, like most of your listeners, I've been thinking about this. And after your episode last week with Brian and Diana, like thinking of their story and thinking of my own. I was a college student like you. I was a freshman in college, and thought it was an accident. I only saw the first plane, and then I had to go to class. But by the time I got to school, everything had been called off for the day. I remember, I'm sure like many of you, like trying to figure out what was going on, why what was going on. And then, merging from that in the next couple of years, leading up to 2003 and our invasion of Iraq, I was very much into Michael Moore, so Fahrenheit 9/11. And that was my, I don't know what the word we want to use, but I mean, that was where my anti-war stuff came from initially, was him and his work. Mm-hmm. And so it builds from there, like anything else, to then what leads me to then become a military chaplain, and like being in uniform, and deciding that even with my reservations about the war and about war in general, what leads one to then become a member of the military. And so that's a little bit of the tension that I know we're going to get into.
Yeah. Well, I remember after it having this confliction, because my family are like have a stack of pacifists and a stack of military. Right? Like my grandfather was the chief master sergeant of the Air Force, and then my dad has a bumper sticker that says, "When Jesus said love your enemy, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean bomb them." Right. So both of those are there. And yet underneath it was some kind of confidence that the weird mixture of dialogue in the church and in the among the state in the public square, we were in some sense the good guys, or at least better than the others. Right. And I think 9/11, like I remember that initial response where even those of us who might have been suspicious towards imperial power or the big grandiose vision of America, that like once we experienced the fear right? Of not knowing. And then after, remember all the anthrax scares and all that kind of stuff. Like once we had a taste of what so much of the world experiences because our drones are flying over. Anyway, because we've decided that a totalitarian regime's great if they cooperate with us. Like once you had that, I felt different things go through me. Right. I remember telling Alicia we were dating then. I was like, man, I'm gonna have to do cardio because I don't want to be the slowest one if we end up in war. And I remember like for a couple of weeks, I was just like running. And I really thought, I'm gonna get drafted and I don't want to get shot. But at the same time, I was a follower of Jesus. So like when how would you describe like not just the uncomfortability around the whole thing, but how you understood your life as a disciple in the midst of those kind of different allegiances to state, to nation, but also to when you end up in a chaplain, to the very people you're there serving.
Yeah, it was always a tension because you're right. I was still young, but still very anti-war, and was frustrated with what at the time around me was mainly either evangelical or non-denominational church life. And so it was hook, line, and sinker, pretty much on board. And if you weren't on board, and if you weren't going to vote for Bush, and if you weren't, in 2004, then you were, going against God. And so that always felt troubling to me, even though at that point, I didn't feel like I had a really refined theological analysis of why that was. I just knew it didn't feel right. And so then, I can remember, going to protests and being part of the anti-war movement. And so then that really continues until like 2006, when, as I write about in the book, like I don't get into law school. And so I end up moving to Germany for a year to, minister to high school and middle school kids whose parents are stationed overseas. Mm-hmm. And it was being with people in community whose parent, usually the dad, was deployed, completely changed not the way I think about the war, but the way I think about the people who are impacted by the war. So
yeah,
essentially living as single parents, at that point, the constant rotation, the longer deployments, like up to 18 months. And so we're deploying these men and women for a long time. And so I felt that it was, and it's still a tension, I think, to maintain this frustration and theological difficulty understanding what it is we're doing at a foreign policy level, but recognizing that there are people and families that are impacted by this for the past 20 years. Our whole history, but specifically, these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
When you are in Germany and serving the youth, maybe you could say especially for those that don't have military in their family, which is a larger percentage now than it's ever been in the United States. Like, what is that like? I remember the stories of my dad, like with his, like when the letter doesn't arrive on time. This is obviously before internet and stuff, like where you have that kind of constant fear. And then this kids becoming young adults have a love-hate relationship with the state and the military because they're ordering their family around. And then you have partners that are trying to keep family together while threats are around. And like, I just feel like there's, like, what about being in that situation, or how can you describe it, where that's where the vocational call to chaplaincy in uniform came?
Yeah, it was fear, and it was constantly, as you'd imagine, on, like all attention, all energy, all resources were devoted to supporting, the war effort, like what was going on. The group I was mainly supporting and providing care for was mainly Iraq. So that was during the big surge and push in 06 and 07. And so, yeah, and you're right, because there'd be those, the casualty notification officer who everybody knew in those communities what to look for, and everyone knows where everyone lives because, you know, we're the Americans living in Germany. And so like, oh, they're going to Amy's house, that must mean this. And so like everybody knew everything. It's like everyone's lives were intertwined in such a way that there's that constant fear of watching the news. Is it going to be my husband? Is it going to be my wife? Is it going to be my dad? You know, my mom? And so that shapes that culture. I say culture of fear. That feels like a strong way to say it, but I mean, you're definitely on high alert, the stress level. And so then to provide support in that is because that is such a traumatic way to live life day in and day out, year after year, rotation after rotation, that I felt when I left that I needed to do something that felt that would connect to their lived experience, that like I could provide care as clergy from a distance, but it felt like to go one more step and actually be, you know, chaplain in those contexts was worth at least investigating. So that was in 2008.
Mm-hmm. So tell us what it's like going in, like as a chaplain, like you think, oh, I need to have a different kind of solidarity with these people who, in many ways, and I don't think people often know this, but like you said, like, oh, I didn't get in law school, so I'm trying to figure this out. Like so many people in our generation and those younger than us, the military is one path of advancement, right? Like to figure out how you have stability. The military family members will speak glowingly of what the long-term benefits are of being in it, and the deep community you can end up finding with your fellow soldiers and stuff. But as someone who was part of the peace movement and then has this, when you say yes to chaplaincy and go into basic and things, like what were the ideas or suspicions you had in your head that proved true and which ones didn't, or like what did you discover?
That's good. And one other thought is, you're right. So a lot of those kids, well, those teens ended up going to the military themselves, because A, it's what they knew, B, it's what they saw, you know, a loved one do, and for opportunities for advancement. Like it was a not an easy opportunity, but it was a present opportunity to be able to move into this way to provide for their young families. So when I thought it's funny. So I was really attracted, and still am, to this idea of like being where people are. And so being where the soldiers are, being where I'm trying to avoid like really like adrenaline fueled language of being where the action is, because that's not really what it's all about. But that is, when I was younger and specifically picked the Army over other branches, it was because I wanted to be where I thought the action was. And so I would say that was probably pretty common with my colleagues who joined around the same time, like in my little age cohort of people who, like us, were now geriatric millennials, like who wanted to do something because of 9/11. Like 9/11 is in so many people's stories, if not directly, I mean, it's definitely in there indirectly, at least to be able to consider the idea of joining the military as a chaplain. And so what I thought was, at that point, I was bored and tired of the institutional church. And so I knew, like, to bring like some sort of incarnational ministry to people instead of making them come to a church or to a chapel was always a really attractive theological anthropology for me. Like Jesus goes to where the people are. And so for me, that was an early, like, this is what I'm going to do. This is why I'm going to do it. Now, all these years later, I'd say that's still there, to continue to be in these spaces, trying to bring hope in the midst of these like pretty traumatic experiences.
Mm-hmm. When you like, after you finish, you know, basic and the specialist training for chaplaincy and stuff, how did you understand the vocation broadly of being a chaplain. Like, I don't think a lot of people, always get that military chaplain, like that vocation. It means you're going to be, obviously serving people of every faith and no faith. Yeah. But you're also, supported by a particular religious tradition. Like, how does that, the chaplain in our religious diversity, how do you understand that vocation when it's done well?
Yeah, when it's done well. That's a really great caveat. Because the pluralistic thing you're speaking of, that is what's really attractive to me about the chaplaincy. That when it's done right is really beautiful. That we exist for all of the service members, who are assigned to us. It's not just because if I was only providing care to UCC soldiers, I would I wouldn't have a job, because I've still yet to meet a soldier who's a part of the UCC congregation. But and you're smiling because
I know two. That's why I was sitting there going like, and I know two, but only one that served during this time, but I know two just from a church of 700 and some that I served, Yeah. And I don't think the retired ones were UCC when they were in the military.
Right. So. Yeah. And so to be a chaplain then is to exist for and to provide for the religious support of everyone who's assigned to you. And it's not about proselytizing. It's not about like converting people to your particular faith group. That happens. And I think it's, I would call it spiritual abuse, using your power as a minister and as an officer to, bring people over. But, and so much of it, and I was surprised by this, it was less about Sunday chapel or church service, but more and more is about counseling, and more it's about people trusting the chaplain that here is an individual who I have complete confidentiality with, which is a big, obviously a huge deal in the military, but to be able to provide one-on-one counseling care to individuals who are dealing with religious issues, emotional or relationship issues, but coming to the chaplain as you're the trusted source here in the unit to talk to.
And I think that I can't remember his name. He was a Air Force general and chaplain who I met when I was in divinity school, who said that he said one of the most difficult challenges of being a chaplain in general is that you're called to serve people in whatever tradition they come from. Right. And within a military tradition that's informed by a country that has like protection for religious diversity. And so, one of the positive things that chaplaincy does is it creates space for every citizen that's a member of the of a particular unit and the military as a whole to retain the freedom of religion regardless of where they're serving. And that is something that's real important. And he said after 9/11, one of the most difficult challenges is the animating Islamophobia that drove a lot of recruits into the military, and Muslim soldiers who went to serve their country, who experienced that event differently. But so when you think of it, like just that difficulty, and then going to Afghanistan, Iraq, and stuff, what does that look like, and what were the kind of pressures you had to bear as chaplain?
It's interesting because there's also another. You could even go one circle bigger and say, like, we at a foreign policy, we weren't even taking seriously that there's a difference between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and so we get into these things in Iraq in particular where we're surprised that there's a difference, and now we're reacting to it. And so it's like for 20 years, the role of religion in these wars has been, we've been slow to understand it, and we've usually been wrong when we have grasped at it. And so, and you're right, like people who get in, who think they want to go over there and kill brown people, kill Muslims without understanding any bit of complexity about Islam, about culture. And so then we get over there and they're confronted with people who are living lives, or at least trying to live lives the way they are back in the States. And so you meeting people where they are. I know it sounds cheesy, and I'm trying to not sound cheesy here, but like being confronted with that and being confronted with the other changes. Hopefully it changes you in new ways. And it's beyond religion. So when I went to Afghanistan in 2014, that was around the time of the, Don't Ask, Don't Tell getting repealed. And so for LGBTQ soldiers, like finding a safe space or a safer space in the military was just as difficult now as it is then. I mean, then as it is now. And so as a UCC chaplain and trying to like provide space for like all kinds of understanding, like it isn't just religious, but I mean, it's all across the gamut of like, how are we more inclusive of how expanding in different, not just the culture, but therefore who makes up the ranks of the soldiers and service members, because that's where it's coming from. It's coming from the broader culture.
Yeah. I mean, and do you think there's a difference in how you process, like encountering the other across difference when you're in, when you're deployed in a new area versus, I mean, now I'm not even sure America knows how to encounter across difference in their own neighborhoods if the person didn't vote like them. There's a growing cultural hostility to, even your own citizens, let alone in other places. But like, how is the context of military service impact that encounter? Because I mean, there's obviously a kind of trust that's demanded just in your fellow soldiers, regardless of what creed and how they worship and who they love.
Yeah, that's such a good point, especially when you bring in the aspect of trusting our own citizens back home when we don't know who, or even if we do know who they voted for, and like, how do you like make sense of that or make meaning of like, oh, your kids want to play together, but this individual, the parents, judging by their lawn signs or judging by their lack of masks, they did X, Y, and Z. I do think there was more of a in the moment deployed in acceptance in a like an understanding of plurality in the way that how these things can coexist well when they don't exist at all, maybe stateside. And so you come back home, which I think is another reason why homecoming is so difficult, is because those things that haven't been tribal identities in ways to differentiate between people are now suddenly like, that's the currency of how we operate in society. So then to come home and be confronted with, oh, we're not all on the same page or like moving forward with the same mission anymore. We are incredibly divided.
Yeah, it is a it's real difficult, I think, to imagine. And one of the things I loved about your book is the way, one, your own story, the story of those you served, and then obviously your research and things with soldiers, both that are returning home and such, and how they process trauma. And there are just things about, like, even I was reading surveys of like active duty soldiers. So of those serving that were coming back from Afghanistan, over half of them still don't answer basic details of what caused 9/11 correctly, right? Like, so even things we have, we as a nation are still confused, right? Like, very few people think about the role of Saudi Arabia, the close relationship America has with Saudi Arabia, where they came from, that the wife of the consulate is sitting there talking to the hijackers right before it, and like things like that's not there. And so there's all, like, when you're in the military, much like you're in any type of group whose mission is so bound, like a football team, a sport team does this as well, that the narratives that get you there are different than what animates you in the presence, Like, and to do the job, be it like if you're on a sports team or if you're in the military, or you're in a business and working in a startup, there's so many times what the animating story that gets you there has to get set aside just to accomplish what it is you're doing, because it doesn't work if we're debating it. And I remember being so frustrated during this period, talking with my grandfather about all these details. And he's like, Trip, I'm just telling you two things. When I was high ranked, I knew things most of the soldiers underneath me didn't know, and I knew if I told them, they would want to talk. They would want to talk and debate about it, and none of us had that power. Right? Like the role we had was to follow orders, and so that requires a kind of trust in civilian leadership. That obviously, he's looking at me. You have trouble imagining, and I think that's like that. It's just not something I understood till it was explained to me multiple times. The questions you're asking are ones that get you killed if you ask them in war areas, because the demand of allegiance to your other soldiers who could be there for whatever story they're telling themselves. Like more of them get home to family if we save our debating until later. What is that? I mean, how would you describe that? Because I just remember being struck because I wanted to talk about it like someone who likes to debate ethics. And he's like, that's not what happens in the military. That's what the citizens are supposed to do.
You're right. It doesn't, there's that, even if you go over there and you're thinking that this is going to be this holy crusade and we're going to do X, Y, and Z because this is for 9/11, you're quickly confronted with the countries we're in weren't, as you said, like the reasons for 9/11. So putting all that aside though, and if there ever, I can remember having a counseling session. So this was in 2014. So this is when ISIS had first started like really kicking off in Iraq and like retaking spots that had been previously taken by the US forces. And so then they would come to my office saying like, what was the point of all this? Like why we were just there in 2011, 2012, or whatever the year was, and then for it just to get rolled through by this new wannabe caliphate. What's the point of all this bloodshed? Why are we doing this? And so then you have to get that individual to be able to process that, but process that in a way that can not debilitate them to get back out and do whatever their job is, because that's what they want to be able to do too. Because the way you said it is so spot on. Like it's their allegiance to the fellow soldier, the fellow Marine, the fellow sailor, whatever it is. And so how do you talk about these things in such a way that is honest, but also doesn't completely put other people's lives at risk? So yeah, it's easier at home, but it still happens when you're deployed, because how could it not come up?
Yeah.
When you're like, why are we here? Why are we still here? This is deployment number 8, or whatever it is for some people. Why do you think it is? I'm curious to ask you a question. Why do you think it is that now in 2021, the survey of reasons we got into 9/11 are still wrong?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is the foreign policy establishment is one giant monologue, right? Like the fact that people that knew they were lying to get us in to the war in Iraq and propagated the connection between Afghanistan and Iraq, but minimized our connection to Saudi Arabia, are the people giving Joe Biden a hard time on exiting is just dumbfounding, right? Like, and I feel like from my perspective, I think the military industrial complex as a business is so essential to America, and we can't imagine a world where we aren't continuing to be the supreme power. We justify all sorts of stuff. And some things like a couple documentaries and stuff were not allowed to be shared in deployments once they came up. And I understand why. Like, I think as someone who's really critical of it, like I obviously would want people to know, but then what do you do if you're already there and then are like, hey, but why are Bush and Cheney friends with Saudi Arabia and they were sending money to the people who did 9/11 and we're giving them military assistance? Like and let's say that's only half. I only know half the story, even though I spent time reading books back because I wanted to know. Like, who is it that really knows enough to make a good decision? And then are the people that advance there have the kind of character you would trust? I get why we should be suspicious of the whole thing. Yeah. And yet, I think most Americans are comfortable with deaths going elsewhere, even if they aren't necessary, to avoid death and preserve our power at home. And that's why I feel complicit. And that's why I love not love like love because it's awesome, but love the fact that you wrestle with that the effects of putting our citizens in this situation so clearly. Because the easy thing to do is when they get back, we debate the big story. But what happens when there are all these individuals who bear the image of God, are thrust into situations where they don't know the story or the justification? They may even believe what their pastor and parents told them or whatever. And yet they bear the burden of the violence we all, as citizens, pay for, the privilege as a country that we benefit from. And who is it that we send? It's not the ones picking up the perks of being the militaristic empire of the day. It's a large portion of them are, like poor, lower middle class, right? So the framing of your book is important because a chaplain shares the weird position that if you're not in the military, you don't get, right? Of being with these different allegiances, but you also were there to care for their souls. And I don't know, maybe this would be like a good time to explain why or why your particular interest around trauma studies became a way of framing moral injury, because too many people are looking at the Afghanistan thing now through a partisan lens, right? And they don't realize that we've all been a part of creating 20 years of soldiers who are bearing traumas that we on our behalf, and hundreds of thousands of families in Afghanistan and Iraq who lost innocent civilians because we as a country deemed those wars necessary. Like the question of trauma humanizes the predicament in ways that we might think about how to be responsible and faithful with a little bit of it, rather than doing the big debates like if we could go back in time, what would we do, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so what has been so frustrating to me I started the PhD program in 2013 thinking I'm going to write about moral injury from like a generic perspective. And then I deploy in 2014. So I come home and what I want to write about shifts, because it shifts because of what it was like to come home. And so, because what's frustrating is, like you said, now leaving Afghanistan, in the book coming out right now, I was like, oh, I'm pretty hard in the book, especially in chapter 1, that like nothing is going to change. We're going to be there indefinitely. And now that we're not there, but I think my larger point holds that, nothing holds this country together like war. And so it's the bipartisan rebuke of Biden. It's now the New York Times, when they transcribe Joe Biden, they include the stutter in his transcription, like throwing him under the bus and like doing things that they never would have done to him, that he's been doing through the whole primary season, the whole debates, his whole career. They were, holding water for Joe Biden. And now when he does what he says he's going to do, he does what Trump started with, meeting with it, or agreeing to meet with the Taliban. And then so when Biden actually does it, you see the whole legacy media, the whole monolith, like come together, around him to, criticize and say we need to invoke the 25th Amendment and all these things, that it's like, oh, you're not really listening, and you're not really listening to the stories of those who are coming home. And so the thank you for your service, when I think about that phrase, and what I usually have to, I'm not saying don't thank veterans. That's not what the book's about. That's not what any of my other writing has been about. But it's like, if that's where we stop with just what has felt to me as a veteran, as a platitude of, I get my coffee from Dunkin' Donuts on Veterans Day, I have a free parking spot at Home Depot, but at the end of the day, you're continuing to send us into these wars that, through the Afghanistan papers that we have learned, like, you knew were unwinnable, and you continue to send us there. So it's like, stop thanking me for my service then, because you're not really appreciative of it. It's just an easy thing to do. It's an easy platitude. And so the trauma then of the moral injury, and why I really appreciate the moral injury literature, is it gave me a space to talk about what does betrayal look like, either at like an interpersonal level, or if you feel that betrayal from government, the military, state government, now with COVID and masks, like, moral injury gives us a way to talk about trauma in a way that feels more connected to what's actually happening.
Could you maybe share a story or two, like, or composite versions of it, but like, what does a conversation with a chaplain upon getting back and realizing the world you're coming back from really doesn't understand you, and what kind of unique challenges do soldiers carry with them that they aren't often going to voice, right? Because a lot of people listening to this are going to be ministers, and soldiers come back, and oftentimes it takes years before they trust like someone that's not been in the military to hear the stories. I heard stories years after being ministers with people, and they finally come around to trusting you enough. And you think back, what have I said and done that made them think I couldn't even be trusted with the fullness of their story? Yeah, because I think that's a real question that people of faith need to be wrestling with. So I wonder if you could share some narratives to help us get it, to give a kind of the narrative for why thinking about trauma and moral injury was helpful.
I was surprised by the amount of people who asked me. So chaplains are non-combatants, which means we don't carry any weapon, like, at all. So like how medics will have one, for like a last resort, but chaplains as non-combatants don't carry weapons. So just hold that in your mind. I was surprised by the amount of people who asked me how many people I killed in Afghanistan. I thought the question was a joke, which isn't a funny joke, but I was like, oh, you can't really seriously be asking me this, but they were. And then in veterans I've interviewed, veterans I provide care for, like, getting asked that question often, like, I bet you killed a lot of people. How many people did you kill? Like, what was it like to kill somebody? Which is like such a, I'm trying to be polite on the podcast, but like such a stupid, unhelpful, isolating question to ask somebody. And so what was frustrating for me, so I'm in the reserve, right? So like, I have a full-time job. I work as a hospital chaplain, and then I do the reserves, which normally feels part-time, right? Which can make it feel less than. And so when I would tell people at my hospital that I was deploying, they would say, oh, I didn't know we send the reserves over there. I didn't know we send the National Guard over there. And this was in 2013, 2014, where the reserves and National Guard had been a massive part of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and still were, like, all the way up until, we left. Like, and so the feeling of this thing that I'm doing, society just doesn't know they don't know. It may be the real cynical side of me wants to say they don't care. That's not necessarily fair, because I do think civilians care, but it can feel like they don't care in the moment when you're having a conversation. Like, oh, I didn't know we send you guys over there. What is, I think, so important that pastors can know, people who are listening to this, is veterans do want to tell their story. It's just, are you a safe enough person that can hear this story and not either pontificate or interrupt or like try to dampen the story, but like, can you hear what this thing is that I want to tell you? And are you not going to flinch when I tell you? My experience of it, I mean, one of the things about having a 20-year war is it's a lot of veterans who have a lot of different experiences of, one deployment up to like 10 or so, and so like, I'm saying veterans want to talk about their, deployments, which might not always be the case, but telling a war story of an experience is a really important part of reintegration that I think society needs to hear, and needs to hear what it is that we've been asking of for 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. And it makes me think of an encounter I had on airplane, which I'm sure you get different response. When I say I'm a minister and a philosophy professor, then you get one kind of response. But you're like a military chaplain who also is doing a PhD, and I also work in a hospital. But I, not long before we stopped flying on a regular basis, in one of my last flights across the U.S., I was on an airplane and was sitting next to a guy who's sweating profusely, clearly on edge. And he starts talking to me, finds out I'm a minister, that kind of thing. And he was special forces and hadn't seen his mom, he said, in 7 years, and he was going to see her. And he goes, I know she's going to ask me questions like this, and I can't tell her the truth. And I said, well, if you could tell her the truth, what would you want to say? And then I heard, like, essentially whispered confessions of, they did all sorts of black ops. He said, I can't tell my mom that, I went in, we couldn't see what we were doing, and people got shot that I wish hadn't gotten shot. And that I held a friend when he died. And that of everyone in my unit, when I started on my first deployment, there's only one other that's left. Yeah. And I don't even know this country when I come back. No one notices us unless they just want to give us something. He's like going through this whole thing. And he's like, he has real regrets. He doesn't know how he could have done differently. And he doesn't even know if he could tell his mom the truth. Yeah. And he knows she's going to ask questions. And in one sense, like, do we want anyone to feel that way? Right? Like, is that he is bearing that burden? We can't, as citizens, act like we weren't part of it. Even if, even if you were showing up at anti-war protests, like, and I just feel like there's, America's really good at whitewashing all sorts of trauma, be it everyone who was in the United States before it was a country. All the like the 1619 Project does a good job showing this. Not just the military industrial complex does these things, but the prison system does this, right? Like cycles of poverty and violence. And so often our response is to find just the parts of a story we can celebrate, so we don't have to know the pain, struggle, and hurt that's there. And that even shows up in a well-meaning mom. And I thought, as a parent, if I hadn't seen my child in 8 years, there's nothing they could tell me that's going to make me want to do anything other than hold them. Yeah. And he was scared. And I don't think it's because he has a bad mom. I think it's because our soldiers have been put in situations not of their making, and then are stuck bearing a burden.
Yes.
And in the book, you don't just tell us what it was like, and the coming back from Iraq, starting to process this. I remember the first time you told me about your dissertation topic and wanting to switch it and stuff when you were back in California, and the stories that were there, but and doing the, talking about the groups and stuff you facilitated and all that kind of stuff. But you then make that burden and the pain and injury there a place for theological reflection. Was that an easy thing to do, or like what had to happen so you didn't just want to acknowledge and wrestle with these stories you chose, right, to become a chaplain and deal with? But at what point did you realize that those experiences demanded from the church a new kind of engagement and theological reflection?
Yeah, that's great, because it's coming from both sides. So being a chaplain, so that means like I'm asked a lot to do pulpit supply, so to come preach. And so usually you're preaching on Veterans Day or Memorial Day. And I can remember the UCC church we went to in Southern California. I give this sermon where I talk about what we're talking about and what it means to come home, and like what can the church do? And the amount of people who afterwards talked to me and said things like, well, they knew what they were getting into when they enlisted, and it's like, no, have you not been listening? Even if they thought that's why they enlisted, even if we hold what you're saying is true, there's no compassion, there's no empathy, there's no love in that response. And when they come home and they're confronted with the trauma of what they thought they were going to do versus now what they're holding at home, like it is our responsibility as a church to walk with them and process that whenever they're ready to. And the progressive churches can have just as difficult of a time of doing that as conservative churches, because conservative churches typically want to, just like you said, they want to hold that little piece of the narrative that absolves us. And we think we're honoring veterans, and we think we're honoring their service by having flag shows in the church, but that's just still ignoring what it was really like and how we can really come home. And so my frustration was with both sides, but in particular the progressive church, because I'm like, we're supposed to be doing this. Like, how do we not see this trauma the way we would see this if it was here in the States? And so yeah.
So where do you begin to think about it theologically? Like when you take the time to unpack the kind of layers of moral injury that are at play, when you begin to think theologically in the book, you bring together both a liberationist framework, right, which is not something normally brought to anything connected to the military,
I know.
except maybe revolutionaries from a dictator regime. And then you use Bonhoeffer's ecclesiology as a conversation partner to frame it, and it's really centered on ecclesiology, the kind of constructive work. So how did those two dialogue partners come together in a way to really open up space for you to think theologically?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the most important is God being with us, and so that's where the traditional liberation theologies have always been a massive influence and guiding theological principles, that God is with the poor, God is in solidarity with the poor. And you're right, the tension is there, because here I am talking about the military industrial complex, and I'm trying to use liberation theologies, and that's been a tension throughout my writing that people have brought up. And so then one of the reasons I really like using Gramsci in the book is because he talks about that even within hegemonic institutions, there is a periphery, there is a group, there are cells who are working against that, who are trying to save or salvage, the beauty of it. So then Bonhoeffer comes in a really practical way for me. I knew if I was going to come out and say, you military chaplains need to be reading all these liberation theologians, theologians like Cone and Gutierrez, you're smiling because they're not going to do it. And so there was a practical aspect of Bonhoeffer theologically in ecclesiology and sociologically is talking about things about God's presence with the oppressed, with the poor, with those from below. And so Bonhoeffer's ecclesiology gave me a way to talk about what does it mean when I say that we exist in community, and that who I am is just as much impacted by the divine you that I see in you, Trip, or that you see in me. It's not just that we need each other in a really cheesy way, but it's in a deeply theological way. We need each other and we exist for each other. And so when I think about the church and what it can do for veterans, is it's so often an us and them, that there's this military and civilian divide, but to try to find ways to get rid of that and erase that, to say we're complicit in this together as a church. And so to exist together, because then I just gets into solidarity, which is the other huge part of the book, obviously influenced by liberation theologies and, leftist politics of how can we organize differently? How can we move together as a community I have these grand ideas of ending wars, but if nothing else, to move together as a community to live better lives in our cities and our towns, and vote differently, live different lives of opposition than just going along with what we've been doing for our whole history.
Yeah. I really hope people check the book out, because it's not just thoughtful, but it's challenging in the right way. I wonder, thinking of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, is there a question or two that you think the church should be asking itself that, in its, normal form as the, dominant religion of American empire, really aren't going to put on the docket? What kind of question should we be spending time over, using this kind of anniversary to reflect?
Yeah. Ryan asked a question on the Facebook Live episode last week about January 6th, being its own event, a 9/11 type of event. And so when I think about the way we are, it seems as though in the discourse is trying to move away from January 6th already, and so how can the church be a space that we can speak truth to power when these things happen? When these, sorry for the dead air on a podcast, but this was a serious thing that happened. And when these things are unchecked, and when the narrative gets spun, that's how things can escalate. And so the church's responsibility to our parishioners, to our elected officials, is how do we hold people accountable? How do we talk about things in such a way that church is more than just what happens for that hour or that hour and a half on a Sunday? How are we any different than the people we see in our community every other day? And so we have to take that stuff seriously. We started the call before we started recording about how Scotland is taking COVID more seriously, which is, that on its own doesn't say much because of how the US is taking it, but the church should be the one who's fighting this stuff, who's these, the anti-mask stuff. And we try to spin this as a religious liberty issue, but people are dying and still dying, and we should be using just as much of a theological lens and landscape to fight back against terrible theology on the other side. That doesn't connect to war. Sorry, that's just my own tangent. But I do think it connects to what it means to be an informed citizen, and what it means to be an informed Christian in the light of 9/11, in the light of January 6th, in the light of a Trump presidency, of what does it mean to live differently?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that comes to mind just on what you said is that the part of the church's mission is to be a truth-telling organization.
Yeah.
And when we don't even make space for the victims of whatever perverted system to share their whole experience, then how do we get to tell the truth about it? Be it, victims of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of just like empires need for bodies to preserve the power and the system. And when we don't make space for the moral injury so many of the soldiers have to be within the church, it's hard to tell the truth about it. And I remember that essay. I think it's in Theology in the Kingdom of God by Wolfhart Pannenberg, or it's in his book, The Church, one of the two, where he talks about the task of truth telling, and that a lot of times people want to harness the voice of the church for a particular conclusion on whatever the moment of the day is. But one of the gifts the body of Christ should give is a space where the full story of the citizens that are there within that body get their full story gets heard. And that's the space we start to talk. And that begins with truth telling.
Yeah.
And I think moral injury, the reflections on trauma, affect, things like that that are showing up across disciplines now are really spaces where, if we follow the way you hook together the kind of liberation and Bonhoeffer elements, is that what does it mean to be a community that tells the truth about all the broken bodies that make up Christ's body? And when we do, we already know what faithfulness looks like, right? That was it. The other, we know what faithfulness looks like. God does not build crosses, God bears them. And so we know where the solidarity is.
Yeah. And there's a role of chaplaincy that sometimes is easily lost. There's supposed to be this prophetic element. And I remember something you said that stuck with me. It might have been, I remember where I was. So it was like 2013. And you said that, chaplains can be, the phrase you used was golfing buddies to a pharaoh. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about that so often, of if we're not careful, and if we get complicit, and if we are comfortable and we don't speak truth to power, or we don't find those ways to be prophetic, then we can be unwittingly like golfing buddy with the pharaoh. We're just a part of empire. We're just a part of, we are a part of it, but
yeah, how
do we also stand outside of it in a way that can hold it, hold it accountable too? And that's a lonely place.
Mm-hmm. So when, from your perspective, and in this moment, I think is interesting as someone who spends their time in hospitals, right, on a regular basis, seeing what COVID looks like within a hospital, and someone that spent time with soldiers as their chaplain. Have you seen times where churches show up well in those spaces? And if so, what would that look like? Because I think, there's both the medical establishment and the military kind of are these different institutions in the church, and yet they're full of people who, worship regularly, have an allegiance to the way of Jesus. What are ways that church can show up in support those spaces in ways that are not kind of that are encouraging and life-giving in positive ways?
Yeah. So you're right. There's so much of the moral injury conversation that is applicable in healthcare, especially in the past 18 months. And I work at a children's hospital, and so it's affected us a little differently, but it's starting to affect us more. And the frustration is, just like with military, just like with veterans, healthcare workers are called heroes, and it's like, yeah, that's great, and thank you, but put on a mask, like get the vaccine, like do the things that we can do to get back to not normal, but can get back to living life more normally. And so when churches like aren't the site of the protests, where they're not the ones who are saying this is like, churches that do it well are the ones that listen, are the ones that are taking seriously that the most vulnerable around us are the ones who, yeah, you say we all have access to vaccines, but who in those populations still for other reasons don't have access? And so it's like, put on a mask, like do what you do for your fellow human. So the churches that do this as a theological understanding of what it means to be followers of Jesus, that we do this for the least of these, we do this for other people, that there's a real self-emptying of like, I'm going to keep wearing a mask because we don't know what this is going to do to kids, like long term. And so my frustration, and I'm getting frustrated just thinking about it, because we have these conversations about the efficacy of masks still, and it reminds me of conversations around war, like we need to keep deploying, we need to keep doing these things. It's like, no, you're not listening. Like this is what is actually going on. This is what the CDC is saying, like for a healthcare context, or this is what the Afghanistan papers are saying in a war context. Like, here are documents that are saying what is actually going on. And so it sounds like what I'm saying is the church can just listen, which might not have been the grand answer you were looking for, but there is something in there, like, of listening to people's story and believing what you're being told, and then doing something about it, like for those who are the most vulnerable.
Well, I think that is an important task. Just think of how many people of our generation, and then the ones we were youth ministers for, think being a Christian is just completely nonsensical, because not only has the church resisted some rather obvious moral goods they eventually come around to, but they make it definitional to their identity in many places to work against the well-being of citizens of other countries, right? So drones are great, like none of our citizens die when you do them, right? And then you find out, like, even with the exit out of Afghanistan, we thought this targeted strike turns out to kill a bunch of kids and family that had nothing to do with it. And there's almost no complaints on the internet, like in the news and stuff about that. They're still just, Obama and Trump they got stuck in and realized that we had to stay, and now we need Biden. And I just feel like when the most embarrassing voices are the ones that have a flag pin and a cross on their jackets, that just doesn't help anything. And they're being faithful to something. I'm just not sure it's Jesus. So I don't want, I'm cutting myself off from derailing into frantic anger.
I was doing the same thing.
Well, okay, so I had a few people sending questions when I said I was talking to a chaplain right next to 9/11. So they don't obviously flow with what we've talked about. But so one of them was, what was it like, and what is it like dealing with soldiers when you realize that so much of our presumption of our own moral goodness was falsified by things like torture and the Afghanistan pages, like the hiding of the truth. Like, are those things that show up, I guess, in your dealing with it, and how do you process it? Because it's hard to say you're the good guys when we have we're handing off people to other countries who can do stuff to us. We take them, Guantanamo Bay and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's that is why the moral injury literature is so helpful for me, because I would go all the way to the top and say there's a feeling of betrayal all the way from, I mean, multiple, bipartisan administrations. This isn't a Republican thing. This isn't a Democrat thing. This is the glue that holds it together, of lying, covering up, obfuscating what we're really doing and why we're really there. It is a tension that I hold that sometimes I don't even know how to process. Because after 20 years, we're like, there was hesitance that we were leaving. And it's like, what do you want? How is this going to go any different? And so the frustration becomes like, in counseling soldiers or service members, veterans who are dealing with their own, trying to utter something that feels intelligible when the whole thing is so confusing and there's so many emotions mixed in, because I know these things, I've read these things, but I still care deeply about the people I served with and what we did when we were over there. You know what I mean? And so there's a tension of, well, why aren't you listening? Why aren't you reading this stuff? And then you find out, oh, we've been, this whole thing from 9/11 on has been such a cluster and filled with so many lies. Yeah.
So, it is. And do you think part of it is the more of it that gets acknowledged, then, or how is it different for a soldier? Like the more of it you acknowledge, right? Let's say you were, followed your orders, were a faithful servant and all this kind of stuff in your situation, to then find out the people giving the orders you followed, you think are like morally reprehensible.
Right.
Like that has to like impact or, make you more suspicious than even the average citizen to wanting to admit it. Because, like I've thought, how much money have I given to taxes that paid for waterboarding or something like that? Or how many drones have I helped pay for? And I mentioned it once in a sermon and got reprimanded by made a drone joke and got reprimanded by investors in Raytheon in the congregation. And so I had no idea what it'd have been like to have lost friends and know you're going to live your whole life with the guilt that comes with being in a situation like that, and then be told, and here's these other things.
Right. Yeah, there's the layer of shame. So there's a moral injury theologian professor named Zachary Moon, teaches in Chicago, and he talks about moral orienting systems. And so you have this like things are right and wrong that from like your personal life, your values, blah blah blah, and then but you're inculcated into this military or this healthcare, and like wherever you are, and they have their own set of values. So what happens when those things conflict, and what happens when those things are in direct tension with each other? So how do you come home, and how do you live the rest of your life knowing that you did something that was for a lie, right? That you were there, that you're still there, and through torture, through drone strikes, through all these things that you're talking about. How do you live with that? How do you start to process? How do you rebuild your sense of self, knowing that there's this other agent in the picture as well that has put you in that position, has asked you to pull that trigger, has asked you to do that drone strike, and then for whatever reason, now it's 20 years later, and you're an older person, and you're trying to process what it means to come home, being betrayed by your country, by your military, or just being confused. Like maybe you don't even use the betrayal language, but maybe there's just a deep sense of shame of, I thought I was doing what I thought was right, and it turns out it wasn't right at all. So does that answer what you're asking?
Yeah. No, I think it's complicated and hard, and that's why I really hope people, well, one, take to heart what you're saying, but also take time to read the book, because it's an important question. So there are two others. One was, this is an elderly gentleman. He said, I was a Vietnam vet, and after Vietnam, ended up becoming a devout Christian pacifist. And I don't want current soldiers to feel like I felt coming back from the war, but I also want to be faithful in my convictions that the way of Jesus is nonviolent. Given our current context, where the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and these type of things don't always take center stage in the news in the same way it did then, what kind of advice would Josh have for being authentic with my convictions, but deeply caring for those that come back bearing burdens they didn't know they said yes to?
Veteran to veteran support. I mean, even in the interviews I did in the book, it was always, as alienated as they would feel, it would all it would take would be, and it was usually a Vietnam vet too. So it's interesting that this individual who wrote that in is a Vietnam vet, like that this is an individual who, even if we don't agree on anything else and we're diametrically opposed, like this is a person who, like, quote, gets it, that they've done it. They've come home. And so for that individual, that even to be able to hold that intention that you don't want them to come home to what you came home to, but the reality is they might be. And so how can you hold that space with them to be able to listen to those stories and hear hard things that maybe you haven't heard, since you were in Vietnam. And so, like, that's going to bring stuff up for you as well, I would imagine. And so to be able to have empathy, not only for that other veteran, but have empathy for yourself, to be able to hear new traumatic narratives that might reignite or might be triggering for what you've been through. Mm-hmm. And so, because I think you can hold the tension. I think you can remain a pacifist, but still, not I think, I mean, we have to be able to hold this intention that, but because the individuals who are coming home are made in the image of God. And so to be able to provide care and support for them in ways that are meaningful is the job of the church. Mm-hmm. We can still hold all those things in tension. We can still talk about accountability. We can still do all that stuff we need to do. But at the end of the day, there are individuals who are made in the image of God who are having a hard time reconnecting with the church after, war experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the last question is, well, you can take it however you want. But a parent said her college student son is thinking of dropping out of school and enlisting, and she obviously was against her kid dropping out of school to begin with, and then going in the military. And she said, I got frustrated and said, how can you serve a country you should never love? And realized I should take that back, hasn't been able to take it back, and wonders if you have advice on how to even process family members who say yes to serving in the military when you don't know if you could ever support the country enough to do so. And now, obviously, this is in a family situation, but I think that is an important thing the church has to ask in plenty of places. So, like, how do you understand the kind of love of country when it's no longer blind? Right.
Yeah, and that's the question, and that's when I brought up the progressive churches earlier, that was my frustration of, it's so easy because it's you're not implicated in it. How can you just so easily blanket term that this to be in the military means you're this? And so I would be interested in what that individual's reason for wanting to join is. I mean, what is it that they are hoping to gain? What is it that about the military that's enticing, exciting, feels like the next step or the logical next step? What is it about other opportunities? and that's for a parent, that's for a friend, that's for our churches, of to listen to the stories of what it is that's appealing about, you know, military. Because people are still, I mean, obviously people are still going to enlist, we're still going to have a military, and there is something about community and camaraderie and those values that are going to continue to attract people. That's not really answering this mom's question, or any mom's question of what do you do when your child wants to enlist in something that you think is bad. That's not the word, but I'm trying to,
well, I mean, how do you
censor myself?
Well, I mean, how do you how do you continue to negotiate? I mean, you're still in the reserves.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, in one sense, the whole project that you're working on is wanting to honor the actual lived experience of these soldiers, and yet as a theologian and a minister that's following Jesus, you have problems with plenty of elements of the national power structure of sorts.
Right.
But I think there is that assumption that, you know, once you sign up to die and to kill for something, it's hard to be honest.
Yeah.
And like it, and I think that's, I don't know how that's not going to be true, you know?
Right.
And if we weren't already friends, I'm sure I would have worded lots of these questions differently, because I would have been worried that it was offensive or something. But, you know, we've been friends long enough and talked about it otherwise. But I think it's really important. And I think that's connected to why the progressive church has a hard time with soldiers, because we have a hard time with nationalism. Mm-hmm. And not in necessarily in the ugliest sense, but it's like when you're sitting here and know the history, you know, the founding of the country, there's an ugly side that doesn't get talked about. The history of it has plenty of things in it we don't want to talk about. And then sitting here, leaving Afghanistan, looking what happened after 9/11, there's more parts that we don't know how to really talk about. So then to go rah, rah, America is hard, because for some reason you can't love something that also has ugliness you need to grow beyond, unless it's your family. Because then hopefully we all do. But I mean,
hopefully we all do.
Yeah.
I think what keeps me going back is, I'm trying to think of a better way to say it, but I think, I mean, really, it's just to be a trusted space where people can, I mean, it's for the counseling relationships. It's to hopefully that I'm still a vehicle to that represents and offers hope for people, that, you know, that, you know, God still sees them. And so, like when I have, you know, monthly drill this month, we're going to be talking about 9/11. Like, we're going to be talking about this stuff directly or indirectly. And so those relationships go on, and to keep being present and able to hear these stories is a privilege that I still feel called into, like, to be able to be a trusted ear, to be a confidant, to be a counselor, to be a spiritual presence to what it means to live life in this, you know, military industrial complex, because there are people who are spun up in it, you know, caught in the cogs, who more than deserve to have support. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for talking, sharing, but also for writing a book that honors all the different people that you've cared for. And I'm not going to say thank you for your service, but I will just say, minister to minister, I really appreciate that you were able to be present to people that I think a lot of us more progressive Christians wouldn't know how to do a good job being a minister to.
Thanks, True.
And I hope those that have, you know, been energized or challenged in the conversation take the time to check out your book. So what's the exact date of release?
September 15th.
September 15th.
Yeah.
So you can, I'm sure it's available for pre-order wherever books are sold, especially fine ones.
Yes.
Like yours.
Sure. I'll give you a 30% off coupon code if you write me on socials.